Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Tribal Council podcast, where on this podcast, Survivor represents our life, and when it's canceled, so are we. My name is Connor Boudreau, and I'm here with my co-host Ethan Kronk. How are you doing today?
Hello, I'm doing great. I'm doing just as great as I was half an hour ago when we recorded episode 1 of this series.
Yeah, it's been so long, guys. It's been a whole half an hour. Made you guys wait quite a few days, though, probably. Maybe several. We don't know yet.
Should
Given
be
the
3.
spacing of how we're going to plan the off season, probably be, 3 or 4 days. But yeah, today's episode, we're going to be going over the 17th placers of the new era, ranking them between their placements, and continuing this series until we get through every single placement.
Yep, so 17th place. I did mention in the last episode that 18th place is the last one that you want to receive, but 17th could be just as bad. I mean, first boots, at least that's something to remember you by, you know? You hold a title, a certain notable ranking on the season, even if it's not a good one. How much better is 17th, really? Aside from the fact that people aren't as likely to remember you, arguably. So, I've changed my mind. 17th, worst placement that you could possibly get. Um, yeah, I'm ready to rank some losers and talk about why they're losers and why some of them are bigger
Awesome.
losers than others. And
Agreed. And in this case, we're going to kick it off with Jess,
the biggest
who,
loser,
yeah, argument to be made that she's worse than some of the 18th placers. And I mean, it's just a really rough showing when you go to analyze her game. I mean, doesn't really have a significant partnership or allies in the game. Banu's the closest connection that's really developed there, and at the end of the day, it's more of a necessity connection than it is a like true. We've developed a friendship or a relationship that's going to help us develop in this game.
yeah, Jess and Bonnie was not striking me as an iconic duo by any stretch. Um, it's not really her fault. She has pretty bad ADHD and she was forced to be off her meds, just how it works on Survivor. Um and yeah, she isn't the first person voted out, which is something that from her tribe, which is something that you can give her credit for, but then she's just I mean, she almost is. She's the initial target. It's only due to Jelinski's flakiness that she ends up surviving that first tribal. And that second tribal, she tries to make something work. She tries to gun for Kenzie. In hindsight, maybe people should have gone with it, but it doesn't work out for her. And yeah, I think there's something to be said about the fact that unlike literally anybody else on this list, I don't think she forms a single genuine, solid connection and like real strategic alliance. Because Bonu hardly counts as a definitive ally for Jess. Um, and that's sort of why we chose to put her in ninth place here. Um,
Yeah, and the real kicker is when your best ally is the person you end up writing down on the parchment. Not typically a great sign for your game.
no, definitely not. um, yeah, and especially when you're the second boot, but the first boot writes your name down. Um, even Bono, I think, writes her name down. I think it's a unanimous vote, right? So
Hmm. Yeah.
just altogether, really poor showing. And there are positives that you would think would put her above certain players on this list, but we really tried to justify it, and we couldn't. It felt right putting her in ninth. Um, but we did almost put a different player in ninth place. Instead, we chose eighth place for this player, but here we have Brandon Donlon, and you know, never a good sign when your greatest enemy in the game is a 2-foot ladder, right?
Uh, yeah. I mean, unfortunately as well, also suffers from the fact that unlike Jess, he forms a great ally, good partnership, and then they quit. you know.
Well, and how strong of a bond was that bond with Hannah really? I mean, I think that there's something there. I think it was better than the Jess and Bonu connection, but at the end of the day, it's not like I don't really think they were ride or dies. I think Brandon was kind of hoping that he'd get in with Caleb and Sabaya, and that was just never a real possibility for him. Um, yeah, he obviously his severe anxiety gets in his way a lot in the game. His challenge performance is just really, really, truly terrible. Quite possibly one of the worst challenge performers in a tribe sense that we've seen, particularly in the new era. Um, he's a consideration to go home first, though there's definitely a decent shot that that would have ended up being Emily. And then and then Emily is again a consideration to go over him in 17th, but ultimately Caleb chooses to bring Emily in. He doesn't choose to really do this with Brandon. Brandon's not able to contribute much to his tribe. His anxiety prevents him from really forming the social bonds he needs to, the strategic connections, and he goes home in with a pretty sad showing at the end of the day. I love Brandon. I've heard he's great on Rob Has a Podcast, but on Survivor, not so much. Anything else to say about Brandon before we move on?
Um, Honestly, it's just a shame he couldn't climb his way higher up on this list.
Mm, yeah. That's a good one. Okay. I see what you did there. Ah, you sneaky
Yeah.
bastard. um, in 7th place, we got TK Foster. So TK, why do we have TK so low? He forms a bond, forms a couple bonds. He forms one with Kyle that's particularly strong. He forms one with Tiana that seems like it could serve him in the game, but he just completely blows it up. Right off the bat, he's hated by Sue, just out the gate. Not a great sign to be so genuinely disliked by one of your tribe members so early on. And then his attitude after losing the second challenge of the season is just sour, and it gets on Tiana's nerves. He makes a really bad social play, I guess you could say, and it loses him an ally that he already had. I think that's pretty bad. And he ends up going home. Mind you, it's not unanimous, so that's a positive. Connor, you seem particularly low on TK's game, because we did debate putting him above the next player we have on this list, but ultimately chose to put him here. Why don't you take the floor on why TK is a particularly bad 17th placer?
The big thing for me was in the game of Survivor, one of the most valuable tools you can have as a player is trying not to ever be on the bad side of someone. Just always being liked enough to not get rid of you, but not being liked too much is typically the place you want to be with most players, if not all players in the game. However, TK found himself in quite possibly the opposite situation where he was so adamantly disliked by someone that it was basically a 50-50 if he was going home at any tribal council where Sue was attending. So, you know, I just don't think that that's necessarily a smart option in the game of Survivor is to just ever be so set in the way of who you are as a person that you can't adapt and give yourself an opportunity to maybe not deter people away from considering you an ally. And unfortunately, I think that's exactly where TK's game goes wrong. Is he puts himself in a situation where his entire list of allies is limited to people that are willing to put up with how he chooses to behave. And, for some people it worked. Him and Kyle got along quite well. As you can see for Kyle, he ends up quite a bit further in the season. So it wasn't necessarily the end of the world. But in TK's case, he picked the wrong place and time to make these kinds of, game choices, right? You have to make sure you have enough allies to stick with you no matter what situation. And he didn't get himself a group of allies that was committed to him.
Yeah. I mean, he was hated by Sue. He ended up souring his relationship with Tiana. Gabe never really liked him. Um, I don't really know exactly how Caroline felt about him. I don't think she felt particularly strongly about him, but she was willing to vote him out when he was a clear physical asset to his tribe. And that's something that we talked about with Abraham, something that we talked about a little bit with Jelinski. Being such a big, being a terrible challenge performer is definitely something that, you're going to be knocked for, but being a really good challenge performer and still getting voted out because your social and strategic game was that bad um, so early on is honestly a little bit worse in some ways. So, and he's really the only person on this list that we're going to talk about, aside from maybe one other person who was a really truly strong physical player who was really helping his tribe that ends up going home this early. First from his tribe, the first person voted out from his tribe as well. So for those reasons, we have him at number 7. Now, number 6, we have the 17th place finisher of the most recent season, season 49, Annie Davis. And Connor, I think I've kind of started off most of these players, so why don't you take the reins for Annie?
Yeah, Annie unfortunately found herself in a pretty awkward situation where she thought she was so in control of the game. Her and Alex were going to dominate, and she was so in charge. And then reality came crashing down when the votes start getting read, and she realizes, they're for me. All of them. Fantastic. So yeah, unfortunately, Annie couldn't read the room. That was the big knock against Annie, is when situation came push to shove, they were very willing to just, all right, let's cut Annie out. We don't need her. She isn't really an asset for us. And she underestimated the bonds that her unfortunate target, Sophie, had with Alex, Jeremiah in particular, and obviously Jake. So, you know, wasn't really socially aware enough, didn't really give herself much room to work with, and ultimately got voted out pretty quickly.
Yeah, and one thing that we kind of talk about, that we kind of are probably going to end up talking about quite a bit for the 17th placers, is just how many allies they actually found themselves with in the game. Uh, Player like Jess didn't really have any. Brandon kind of had one. TK kind of had two, but ended up losing one. Annie only ever had one. Annie's only real ally ever was Alex, and he was pretty quick to turn on her um, when he found himself in a 4-person alliance that was just more beneficial to him. So really, that was sort of the argument for putting her potentially below TK. But at the end of the day, TK was this massive challenge asset. Annie was okay in the challenges, not the worst person on her tribe by any means, but certainly not the best. And so she doesn't have that inherent reason for her tribe to keep her around that she actively would have had to have fought against, played so poorly to fight against, in order to get voted out here. That's sort of the argument for putting her above TK. It's just that, you know, she's inherently not as much of an asset to her tribe, which means that going home so early isn't as shocking. It isn't as much of a how do you manage to play so poorly as the strongest member of your tribe that you go home first from your tribe. The other argument being that Annie doesn't go home first from her tribe, unlike TK. So at the end of the day, we weighed things out. We ended up putting her above TK, but you know, these are two players that could really go either way for me. So ultimately, Annie lands here at 6th, and at 5th we have Zach Wurtenberger. Again, think about how many allies a certain player has. Zach has a pretty strong connection with Romeo very early on. He kind of tries to form a connection with Tori, though we end up seeing how that actually ends up going. He has enough of a relationship with Drea that when Drea decides that she wants to target Tori, she goes to Zach to try to recruit him. But Connor, how exactly does that play out for Zach? That whole situation.
Well, you see, sometimes in the game of Survivor, when you want to try and flip things on someone, you'll maybe say, hey, this person's trying to target you. Maybe we target them. Unfortunately, you should never try to do this when you are by yourself on the bottom and people are already thinking about voting you out. So, in this case, we see Zach very quickly get booted from the season and immediately end up the first chronological person to be voted out unanimously from a shot in the dark play.
But at least he had the reads to play a shot in the dark. At least you knew that he was receiving the majority of the votes, and that's something that you can give him some credit for. I think that if he doesn't go to Tori and say, "Hey, look, Dre is targeting you," there's a chance that he ends up potentially taking Tori out and surviving the first tribal of the season. The other thing that, of course, plays a role in his elimination is his challenge performance. He doesn't deliver in the puzzle. He obviously isn't the sole reason why the challenge is lost, but he ends up taking more credit for it than he kind of needs to, which just gives his tribe a good excuse to vote him out. I'm of two minds about this move. Like, obviously, it doesn't work out for him, and it's very reasonable to see why it wouldn't have worked out for him. But at the same time, I see where he's coming from, wanting to take ownership because people tend to respect that. But at the end of the day, it gives Swati, the other person who was involved in the puzzle and also could probably take some ownership for the loss, a reason to target Zach, a reason to shift any sort of blame off of herself and go, hey, look, Zach took the fall for the challenge. We can pretty securely say that it was his fault and vote him out, can't we? And that combined with his sort of wishy-washiness on whether or not he wants to work with Tori or target Tori ends up being his undoing. But I do think he plays a little bit better than some of the players we have below him at the end of the day. Are we ready to move on to number 4?
Yeah, I think we can segue quite well into Justine. And unfortunately, Justine kind of had a very interesting undoing. Honestly, she had a pretty interesting go at things, I would say. Unfortunately, she ended up in a situation where somehow, again, the person she tries to target seems like a recurring theme from this season. People try to target the wrong person. And in this case as well, she also kind of gets outplayed by Cody. Cody and Jesse quite quickly go to NECA. NECA seems like a logical person to target, and unfortunately for Justine, it just isn't the right person, given that it ends up being part of the problem that there's a 3 strong going against 2 votes. The funny kicker at the end of this as well is that Justine just throws a vote on Cody, and so we don't even have a 3-2 vote. We have a 3-1-1, where poor Noel just throws a vote on someone, and it's not even a unanimous secondary target.
Yeah, I mean, it really should have been. This bizarre vote on Cody is kind of part of the reason why Justine was pretty definitively not going to crack the top 3. But at the end of the day, like I mean, again, it goes back to how many allies do they have? Well, for however many allies we can say any of these players have, none of them ended up voting with them when push came to shove at the tribal council where they were eliminated until Justine. Justine had Noelle, and Noelle voted not with her technically because of her decision to randomly vote for Cody, but for the target that they had agreed on going into tribal council. Noelle votes for NECA, and I think that that's um, a solid boon for her. And like thinking about it more, do you think Dwight ultimately um, would have likely targeted NECA if he had his vote? We could have seen a 3-3 tie, though we also could have seen Dwight choose to side with the other three just to avoid a tie. But that's a pretty impressive showing for somebody who was the first boot from their own tribe. And she's targeted for reasons that are kind of unexpected, right? Like she's a salesperson. I guess she should have lied about her job, but that's something that everybody says is kind of overrated. Like, why is everybody lying about her job? Well, Justine is the reason why people lie about their jobs, because it can get you. People can decide for whatever reason that you need to go because you're a salesperson. A salesperson can decide that you need to go because you're a salesperson. And I think that's a little bit unlucky. I think she does put up a solid effort to save herself. I think she targets the most reasonable person for her to target, and she gets unlucky in a lot of ways. But that random vote for Cody just really, again, I don't think it was a strategic move to begin with. Like, I don't think she made it with the intention of it being a strategic play, but it's just not the thing that you want to do when you're potentially going home and hoping that maybe something happens to um, save you. So for those reasons, we had Justine at number 4. And then number 3 is somebody who I was kind of surprised by how high we ended up putting her, because I don't remember too much about her game being all that positive, but Sara Wilson, actually a surprisingly good 17th placer, especially for somebody who goes home in the first episode. I've been talking for a while though, so I'll let Connor um give his thoughts on Sarah.
Yeah, I was definitely, I think, part of the party that helped move her up a little bit. There was some discussion between a couple players that were at the upper echelon, and the big thing that really drove home Sarah being one of the top 3, but not necessarily 1 or 2, but again, still pretty high up 17th placer, was a couple of key factors. A, had an opportunity where there was 3 people, herself included, on her side in a 6-person tribe. Having half the tribe be in your alliance is typically a pretty good sign, which is compared to all of the players previous, a significant upgrade. On top of that, the big reason that she ends up being kind of ostracized from the tribe and is ultimately voted out is because Brad chooses to blame her for a challenge that is equally lost by 2 people. Ironically, Sarah herself and Shan, who is in said alliance. But in process of saving herself, Shan chooses to flip on Sarah. And it's kind of an unfortunate end result because Sarah was playing a fairly solid social game. She had developed a, you know, duo to go with her, making up what could have been half the tribe.
Yeah, and I mean, she doesn't end up going in a unanimous vote with Jeannie throwing a kind of random vote on Ricard. Um, she has a pretty solid target in front of her. In terms of JD, he's somebody who does end up becoming a sort of a perennial target on that tribe, but him and Shan have a conversation where they he sort of gets into her good graces, and all the while Sarah is a little bit of irrelevant. I mean, she does spend a lot of the first episode of the season crying. Um, that's just never a great look for a player, but yeah, no, I mean, at the end of the day, it's her alliance with Shan and Ricard that does get formed, even if it doesn't end up lasting a whole episode. It's her, decent sense in terms of targeting JD. She then flips her target to Brad, which perfectly reasonable move to make against somebody who is very publicly putting her name out. And then the vote isn't unanimous, even if it's not unanimous in kind of a strange way. Major knocks, she doesn't play her shot in the dark when she probably should have, but I'll give her a little bit of slack that she did initially want to play her shot in the dark. She heavily considered it, but was convinced not to by Shan. And she's just kind of crying all the time. And she, was contributed to Ua's loss, mind you, in a challenge where only one tribe won. If this was a normal, two tribes win immunity, they wouldn't have even gone to tribal council. So that's another thing. All of those things really do elevate Sara above Justine, Zach, Annie, all these other 17th placers. But our top two is a pretty strong top two considering how low of a placement we're talking about here. So she wasn't going to be able to crack that, but she was a surprisingly solid 17th placer, all things considered, and I feel good about having her up here, but I definitely didn't expect it going in. That being said, second place and this top two was actually pretty heavily contested. We went back and forth, but we have Kevin Leung, and Kevin goes into the season. He forms a strong alliance of four that actually does stick together for a vote. That's something that we can't say about any of these other 17th placers, that he forms an alliance that actually sticks together for a vote, right? Annie, she survives that first tribal council, and it is like a vote that she's part of. Same with Brandon, same with Jess, but none of those players could really consider themselves part of an alliance. Kevin very definitively is part of this alliance with, say, Cedric and Justin that vote out Stephanie. He then forms a connection with Mary, the one person on the outs. He is her closest ally when Stephanie is gone. Arguably, he's in the best position on that tribe, but he makes a mistake in targeting Say. Now, this is something that Justin is even willing to consider. This is something that Mary is totally down for, but Kevin doesn't know that she's lost her vote, which is another pretty unlucky situation for him. And it really just comes down to Cedric is not willing to do this, leaks the plan to Say. Justin's kind of forced to go along with the Say and Cedric. Say decides that she wants to flip the target onto Kevin, and it's an unfortunate exit for a player who really had a lot of potential and really found himself in a phenomenal position. I don't know, Connor, do you have anything to add on about Kevin?
Yeah, a couple more things that could be mentioned. He does somehow, through all of this, technically result in an idol flush. So, yay for Kevin. You did something kind of cool, even if it's half Cedric's fault, because, well, Cedric has no business telling Say to play the idol unless he is trying to intentionally vote her out and then get it flushed or something. I don't really understand how that's beneficial for Cedric's game, whereas her having the idol is an idol for you and your allyship. But, you know, we'll get to Cedric later. But in terms of how it works out for Kevin, technically accomplishes something he was trying to do, which was flush an idol that he didn't want, oddly enough, one of his allies to have. Um, and then the other thing that's really cool, just a little bonus fact, he does happen to, kind of flub the first challenge, but then goes on to win supplies for his tribe. Somewhat, you know, because of Kyle messing up, but he keeps himself in the challenge. He is very much in it and is arguably the challenge, you know, competitor for the tribe. He's kind of their best physical asset. And then ironically somehow gets voted out here for kind of just screwing up the social gameplay enough that he gets pretty heavily targeted out by Say. So
It's a
all in
situation
all,
there.
yeah, all in all, he has a pretty quick come down from a pretty, steep high.
Hmm. Well, and you could compare him to a player like TK, who also, despite being the biggest challenge asset, ends up going home really early. But TK never finds himself in nearly the position that Kevin is. At no point is TK just so clearly the best position player on his tribe, whereas Kevin is. Um, and Kevin ends up losing that position for reasons that I don't think are as obvious as TK's. Um, I think that Kevin does some things that make some sense. He does some things that maybe don't make a whole heck of a lot of sense, but ultimately, he plays a really good solid game. He finds himself in a fantastic position. He makes some decent reads. He makes some wrong reads and ends up losing a lot because of it. But that's kind of how you end up in 17th place at the end of the day. Like, I just can't think of anybody else on this list aside from one person who we'll get to in a second here who I can say played a better game than Kevin. And I'd love to see Kevin back, honestly, because I think he could play a great game if given another chance. But that being said, number one, the best 17th placer in the new era, um, the second boot of Survivor 44, Maddy Pomilla. I'll let Connor take the reins on Maddy because I think he was a pretty major influence in putting her up here at number one.
Yeah. Maddie, I think, ends up in one of the strangest and most unfortunate results that you can say for Survivor players elimination, especially this early on in a game. She ends up A, getting eliminated by a single vote, B, because somebody played an idol, C, three different people just choose not to vote, two of which because of shot in the darks, and one of which because of their ability to bank a vote. So an advantage, but three votes uncast. So three votes are cast in a six-person tribal, and she goes out in a one vote elimination. Tough road, especially considering Maddie's position was clearly pretty solid. The big knock you can say against Maddie, well, she was so adamantly against the person who had the idol that his immediate thought was, if I just played the idol, I can just get rid of them. And then we start fresh. Everything's all nifty dandy. And I mean, it kind of ends up working out that way for him. But yeah, that's just a very unfortunate way to go, given you probably had a decent spot in the game if, hypothetically all of your allies just don't choose not to vote.
You have to wonder who they might have chosen to split their vote on, to be fair, but like, I don't know, even if she just been a little bit more discreet about targeting Brandon, things could have gone so much better for her. But at the end of the day, I think the bottom line is we're talking about how many allies you had. Maddie had the entire tribe. Maddie had the entire tribe um, willing to vote with her for Brandon. Now, mind you, a lot of them don't because they choose not to vote at all. But Kane votes with her. Um, Jamie, Matt, Lauren, all heavily consider voting with her, aside from probably Lauren, who I think was always going to bank her vote. But, if she were to vote, I think she probably would have considered voting with Maddie. She kind of like, I don't think anybody else who's come in 17th place can say that they had as many allies as Maddie did potentially. And why do you think she makes a clear mistake in targeting someone who she knows has an idol so obviously and so publicly that he ends up playing his idol and choosing to idol her out? You don't come in 17th place without making some sort of mistake. Every single one of these players that we've talked about has made a mistake. None of them had as many allies as Maddie did. None of them got eliminated to a one vote tribal council. None of them found themselves in such an insane situation that she's literally the earliest person in a season to ever be idled out. And so for those reasons, we believe that she played a better game than all these other 17th placers. And yeah, that puts her at number 1 here. So that being said, next episode we'll be going through all of the 16th placers and ranking them. Until then, though, I hope you guys enjoyed this episode. And the pod has spoken.